Welcome to the Strauss Company July 2021 special exhibition called Social Stances, the Art of George Pemba and Robert Hodgins. These two artists, as you can see from these two portraits behind me, work in very different styles. George Pemba in a social realist style and Robert Hodgins in a more abstract expressionist style. One of the subject matters that these two artists have in common is that of politics. Robert Hodgins often used the figure Ubu in his paintings. Ubu is a fictitious character invented by the French dramatist Alfred Jarry, referring to sort of this very comic dictator, a person in power but not quite knowing what to do with it. And this particular example, Ubu and the Black Politician, was painted in 1983. At that moment, when the apartheid government reached out to the politicians, the black politicians of the so-called homelands at the time. Pemba, very deeply involved in the politics, especially of the Eastern Cape, and in this particular work, he depicts the return of the exiles, as this particular work indicates. And what is interesting to me is the fact that a number of these people welcoming the exiles back are dressed in a religious uniform. So the idea of religion and politics working together, I think, is well portrayed in this particular example. One of my favorite pairings between these two artists are these interior scenes. Now, obviously, the still life painted by Robert Hodgins, the large-scale work here, is very different to the very intimate interior scenes painted by Robert Hodgins. But the interesting thing is that once you start analyzing the work, you can see the similarities and how these two artists went about depicting perspective. Look at the Robert Hodgins, for instance, and you will see just the hands of the poker player. This work is called The Poker Player, and you can just see his hands here, the table from the top here, and images, these black images indicating spaces lying beyond the picture plane here. And when you look closely at these two lovely, very intimate interiors, you will also see a type of still life on the table, playing itself out there on the table, similar to what you see in the Robert Hodgins work. This work is no less complex when it comes to perspectives. Look, for instance, at the perspective suggested in the picture within the picture. Look at the perspective beyond the interior, the woman pointing to the landscape lying beyond this intimate kitchen. George Pemba was also very fond of depicting traditional African life, African history, and traditional customs and practices, as you can see in these two examples, Sangoma at the top and the death of Shaka Zulu at the bottom. Another traditional practice is that of the so-called khotla, the elders of society getting together, making important decisions. And you can see such a meeting depicted in this work. And I couldn't resist pairing it with this work by Robert Hodgins called A Bad Day at the Office. The board meeting, of course, differing and disagreeing about all sorts of things like that. So it's interesting to look at the manner in which that group of figure is played out in the composition and comparing it to the figures on this side. What is striking about this group is the posture of the two figures. Pemba depicting a so-called agitator, one of those charismatic leaders that took the lead in the struggle against apartheid, especially in the Eastern Cape. And then you have here a fitting of a tailor saying, "Is it too tight under the arm, sir?" So very humorous, the stances that these two artists took up against their societies. Arguably, the most majestic work on the exhibition is this work in the SABC collection called Four Figures for a Sistine. As you can gather from the title, this is a reference to the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel in Rome, painted by Michelangelo. But here Robert Hodgins is not depicting any religious figures, any biblical figures. He is referencing the four figures on the very corners of that majestic dome in the Sistine Chapel, and those four figures represent humanity, the ordinary people. And you see them depicted here. Look carefully at their faces, and you can see all humanity with its pathos, with its happiness, with its sadness depicted in the different works. Another interesting pairing, examples of boxes of what people do in their leisure time. George Pemba at the top, another work from the SABC collection. And when you look carefully, you will be reminded of the so-called American regionalists, such as George Bellows, who is famous for his depiction of boxing scenes inside and outside the ring. Robert also addressed the theme of the boxers. His work is titled Man with Bandage, and he's referring to the bandaged foot here. And that is a motif he used in many of his other works. For instance, he depicted boxers as well as a young boy working, delivering papers in the streets of London. He would often drop off papers at these clubs, these boxing rings. So he got to emphasize the boxers and their plights. Punch drunk, perhaps, but full of humanity, and Robert depicts them with all that empathy. Another interesting pairing, these two portraits on the left by George Pemba and Robert Hodgins right here. What interested me was the sitter depicted against a picture within a picture. You can see that clearly in the Pemba portrait, a portrait of the granddaughter of Sol Plaatje, and in this work by Robert Hodgins called Nymph Interrupted. Clearly a life model posing for art students, but also with pictures within a picture. Wonderful subject matter, waiting rooms, consultation room by Robert Hodgins, and the waiting room here. And you can see the patience of the people here in a neat and orderly session. And in the Robert Hodgins work, it seems as though these patients are completely isolated. They don't have anything to do with each other. They are just patiently waiting to be attended by the doctor, the person in power. Look, for example, at this interesting pairing. You have George Pemba depicting a concert of Zulu dancers and singers, and you have Robert Hodgins, spectators or viewers looking at an art exhibition. Compare the interesting composition of the very pronounced horizontal line in both works here, and you will see what I mean. The audience at the bottom looking at some activity in front of it. The exhibition, Social Stances, the art of George Pemba and Robert Hodgins, runs till the 30th of July. Under lockdown, I'm sure few of you would be able to view it, but you can always look at the virtual 3D gallery of the exhibition posted on our website, as well as discussions I had with experts in the field, Neil Dundas on Robert Hodgins and Sarah Huddleston, who wrote a book on the work of George Pemba, as well as a teacher workshop. All these are available on our YouTube gallery to watch. So just go to our website, Strauss Art, and you would be able to see all the information and the links to access those talks and programs.